the vault, high atop the Pastoral Center of the Diocese of Camden, you're listening to Talking Catholic.
Hey everybody, it's Mike Walsh, and you're listening to Talking Catholic. Welcome back for another episode. I know I always say every time we have everybody on the podcast, if you hear my voice first, that can't be a good thing. But the truth of the matter is, this week I do have a co-host with me. It's actually one of my newest co-hosts. You had the pleasure, if you listened to last week's episode, of learning all about her. She's the new managing editor of the Catholic Star Herald, Jen Mauro. Jen, welcome on as my co-host this week after being my guest last week.
Thank you. I'm excited to try out my skills as a co-host here after only 3 days ago learning that this would be happening. So this is exciting.
We move fast around here. We move very quickly. But you are a world-class interviewer, and I thought you would be perfect for the podcast, so I wanted to have you on. I'm curious, from last week's episode, now we're recording this only about a day or two after our last podcast broke, but have you gotten any feedback yet on your podcast episode from the other week?
I actually have. I had a few people listen to it on domestic church media, and then also through social media, and I've gotten a lot of good responses saying I'm a natural. So I guess you're choosing me as another co-host. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, everybody thought that the interview was great because they like to hear about the new the diocese that I'm working for. That's new to me.
Yeah, that was a good conversation. You know, we always, my co-host last week was Mary McCusker, and she's always so critical of herself. And I sit there going, man, she did such a great job with this episode. She's taking a much needed vacation this week, which actually pains her greatly because she is a huge fan of our guests this week. She loves talking to them. She hates editing his stuff because she'll read through it and then she'll go, I'll never write this well. I will never, ever be as good as this writer, which I think it's good to have goals and to know your place in life, because I too will never write as well as our guest today. What about you? You know our guest fairly well at this point, Jen. Do you consider yourself someone on his equal?
Not even close. When I read our guest columns here, I'm a little blown away. I slow down. I actually really read these to pay attention because there's a lot of good lessons and just a lot of food for thought in them. The most recent one about the Latin Mass, which we'll get into, but I've already had multiple conversations with readers on that column. So
yeah, it's I'll just introduce him now instead of talking about him like he's not here. With us today is noted Catholic Star Herald columnist and professor of Loyola University Chicago's Institute of Pastoral Studies, Michael Canaris. Dr. Canaris, how are you?
I'm great. How are you? This is just so humbling. The last time I made a joke when we opened that my parents are going to love this, and I feel the same way again. They'll be excited to get the link. But thank you so much. It's really wonderful, and it's always a privilege and an honor to be here with you.
Well, it was certainly something that when I came on board with the newspaper, 5-6 years ago, the paper had a certain perspective to it, and I was, being someone who's kind of has an appreciation for academia, I really wanted to make sure that we had regular columns that were from a very educational perspective, really help people to understand some nuances to our Catholic faith that maybe they might not understand. And which I think is one of the great difficulties of our religion is that it's 2,000 years old. There's a lot of tradition. There's a lot of dogma. There's a lot of things you need to be able to understand. And quite frankly, most of it's over the head of the common Catholic, of which I am one of them. So, Mike, I very much appreciate the fact that you write so eloquently about some of these topics. Now, but we do want to have you on. We specifically want to have you on to talk a little bit about the Latin Mass. But before we get into that, I wanted to kind of ask you, what kind of got you into this road of theologian? You've become quite noted in that regard. Is this something you grew up with such an appreciation for the Catholic faith that you went down this path, or do you really like minutia?
Well, I'm a huge proponent of Catholic education. So I was in Catholic school from kindergarten through Ph.D. So I think it worked out to 30-something years, I guess. But I originally went away as an undergrad to the University of Scranton after becoming a Catholic, to study sports journalism. And so I wanted to be a sports writer. I wanted like nothing more in life than to cover the Eagles or maybe the Saints. I like New Orleans a lot. So so that was my goal. And then I was invited to a program there that's actually based on the Ratio Studiorum, the method of training Jesuits historically. And so it's sort of an honors program. It was called SJLA, the Special Jesuit Liberal Arts Program. And they really focused on theology, classics, languages, philosophy. And originally I didn't want to do it. And my mom said, well, you know, try it for a semester. If you don't like it, you can drop it. And like my first semester, I remember the moment, my first semester of my first intro to theology class. Now I had been to Catholic school all the way through, but there's a difference between high school religion classes and academic theology as a discipline. And I didn't know that really existed so much. And so I was in my first semester class with Dr. Spring Steele, who was actually the vice president of St. Joe's for a while. And at that time he was at Scranton. And I had this like almost that Matthew Caravaggio moment of like, I want to do this for the rest of my life. And I never really looked back. Now, my father's, he'll love that I tell this story. My father's a retired federal agent, and I got to watch my language when I tell the story. So when I called and said that I want to, it took me a lot of months really to work up the courage to say I wanted to move on from journalism to theology. And his reaction was, what the hell are you going to do with that? You're never going to get a job. So I told him. But then he became very supportive pretty soon afterwards. And you know, he said that I want you to follow your passions, and nobody picked my career, and anything that you want to do, I would support. I'm an only child. So, and now, of course, he's incredibly proud, and everybody, you know, he loves the paper is one of his favorite things that I do, because I do think there's a skill in sort of, like you're saying, distilling or popularizing sort of these more arcane theological debates for a wider audience. And so, you know, to be perfectly frank, my parents are not going to read, as colleagues would, my scholarly writings. And so it's a good window into my mind and heart and soul for family members and friends that they follow along with the paper. So, and it encouraged me to view the world differently, because as I'm sure Jen knows, like when you're thinking as this sort of hidden journalist inside me, you're always looking for an interesting angle of something to write about. If it's anything from gelato to, I'm reading a Shackleton biography now in Antarctica. And I'm thinking, I wonder if there are parishes in Antarctica. I looked it up and I was like, there's an article in there somewhere about that. And so it encourages you to sort of think widely or differently. So I'm really thankful to have the opportunity to do it every week as well.
Mike, do you think that initial interest of journalism led to you also wanting to write columns, to continue to kind of put a foot in each genre?
It does, definitely. I mean, I had a great mentor at Fordham who said, there is still this hidden journalist inside of you that knew, you know, my background. And so so I think I'm able. I mean, I was just awarded tenure, so that's really wonderful. And my colleagues, thank you.
Congratulations. Yeah.
So my colleagues recognize my sort of scholarly output, but I do think that there is an ability or a skill or a passion of mine to sort of serve the church in this way. I do. I look at this as a service component to my life as a theologian. It connects me, of course, to home. You can take me out of South Jersey, but can't take South Jersey out of me, right? But so I'm excited to have that connection home. But it also enables me to sort of again serve the people of God in a local community, both in Chicago and on the East Coast. And so I really I cherish the opportunity to do it. I love it. I'll do it as long as you'll have me.
Well, careful with that. We people stick around here a long time. As you know, our former managing editor just retired after 32 years. We like towns around here. We don't let it go. So the topic that I invited you on specifically to discuss was the most recent text from Pope Francis related to the Latin Mass. I will butcher it. It's called Traditionis Custodes, called Guardians of the Tradition. And it came out a couple of weeks ago. But it certainly created a bit of a stir in the Catholic world, particularly the Catholic theologian world. I think for most common Catholics who haven't had much of an interaction with the Latin Mass, it probably wasn't much more of a blip. But for those who have an appreciation for the Latin Mass, it was certainly, I don't think it would be foolhardy to refer to it as earth-shattering in some ways. And you actually, in your column on the subject, a column titled Latin Mass Limit reemphasizes Vatican II's role in the global church, which can be found at the CatholicStarHerald.org or CatholicStarHerald.org. You actually refer to this as one of the sort of hallmarks of the Francis papacy, this document that he put out. I guess my first question is, can you give us kind of an overview of the document?
Sure. So what the document's goal was, I think, was to re-emphasize the appreciation and sort of legitimacy of the Second Vatican Council. And the way it does that, what Francis sees as a sort of necessary moment here is to sort of rein in a little bit the undercurrent of conversations of sort of forming a church within a church. Now, let me preface this, because I know no matter almost what I say about this, there is nothing that gets people's passions raised, and probably legitimately so, more than liturgy. I mean, like I said in the article, it's the prime expression, public expression of our faith as Catholics. And so people are deeply invested emotionally, intellectually about this, and they should be. And I'm glad that that is the case. So I always want to sort of preface this with being respectful, charitable, without trying to miscaricature other people. We get enough of that in the political discourse today, the sort of villainization of anyone that doesn't share our particular views. And so I want to sort of avoid that and be careful around it. But I do think that what I want to, again, speak as though what I understand Francis to be doing, maybe even separate from what I think. And I believe what Francis is saying and doing is trying to rein in or tamp down any kind of conversations that would say a specific subset of the church is the true, quote unquote, true church, or the only church. And so as I was saying a little bit as we were planning the podcast here, one of my favorite theologians, Karl Rahner, he has this really interesting view of the overarching arc of Christian history. And he says there are three major periods or epochs in church history. There's a very short, brief, but intense Judeo-Christian period where the Christians are still figuring out their relationship to, say, the House of Israel. So how is this going to be a subset of Judaism? How closely related is Christianity going to be to this intensely Jewish period, of course, that is the founding? And we will always have a special relationship with our elder siblings, the Jewish people. But what exactly was that relationship? And that's the major question for this first brief period, maybe 100 years or a little bit more, perhaps. And then you have this really long period of either a Eurocentric or a Mediterraneocentric period that basically runs from the earliest centuries with some of the patristic period up until the 1950s and 60s. And so what happens over that period, if you can picture a map of the Mediterranean basin with Greece, and then far on the eastern side would be the Jerusalem and where all this took place, and you would have Greece and Italy sort of hanging down into the water of the Mediterranean basin. And when I draw this on a map for students, there are sort of arrows from that basin, including North Africa in the earliest period, of course, before Islam, moving outwards towards the rest of the world. So the arrows are moving in one direction. They're moving from the Mediterranean basin and exporting that view to the rest of the world. And so that's why a church in Buenos Aires looks like a church in Madrid, because they were sort of exporting a particular vision of Christianity elsewhere in the world. And it got all wrapped up with colonial expansion, with the age of exploration, with domination and dehumanization of other people, integrated or mixed with incredibly admirable motives. So you think of like the North American martyrs, like they left Europe knowing they would never see their relatives again, probably to be martyred. And so, you know, the balance between colonialization and eradication of local indigenous cultures and the evangelization to the ends of the earth, it's a really difficult thing to disentangle. But that's what's happening for the vast majority of church history. And then Ronner says at the Second Vatican Council, you get the inauguration of what he calls a truly world church. And so again, when I talk about this in my intro to ecclesiology class, you start to have those arrows where they're going in both directions. And so Ronner has a line somewhere that the church of the future will be one that listens to the wisdom from the East, the longing for freedom in Latin America, and the beat of African drums. I love that phrase. And so you're getting this truly dialogical church. And so what I think, to bring it back to the document here, what I think Francis is doing here is moving away, or trying to get the church to move away from this Mediterranean-centric or Eurocentric vision towards a more global perspective. The vast, vast, vast majority of Latin masses in the world are offered in 3 countries: England, the United States, and France. So there's very few Latin masses being said in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in places where there's an explosion of the faith. All of the energy is shifting to the global south. So the future face of the church, I use this in some of my writings sometimes, will be darker, younger, poorer than what we're accustomed to in the New Jersey and Chicago churches. Of course, there's pluralism there, of course, but all of the energy is moving towards the global south. The explosion in Africa is unbelievable. It's unmatched in the history of Christianity. From where it was in 1900, with very, very few Christians in Africa, most of whom were white missionaries, towards hundreds of millions. So it's an explosion over the course of the 20th century. And so I think that Francis is sort of, and again, I know not everyone will agree with this, but I think that what Francis is doing is encouraging people to move away from the vision of taking one page out of a flip book. You know, those flip books are the cartoons. Mm-hmm. If you think of like the whole arc and pluralism of Christian history, from its earliest pluralistic beginnings to where we are headed in the 21st century. And he's encouraging people not to take one page out of that flip book and say, this is the real church. This is what the church looks like. These kinds of vestments, this kind of liturgical celebration. And so how you navigate that between unity and pluralism, between what is timeless and eternal and what is culturally conditioned, these are questions that not only take lifetimes, they take centuries and millennia to work out. And so, of course, it's sort of traumatic, disorienting, disillusioning for many people when I've read a lot of commentary on this. I'm trying to be fair in what I read about it. So I read ardent defenders of the Latin Mass and their reaction to this. And I read it in a sense that is not someone like spiking the football because I'm on Team Francis. I want to see what they're saying. And the idea that countless saints have been inspired to their Christian life by participation in this form of the liturgy, that's a really legitimate point. That's like, we have to really take that into account. But I think that again, Francis, it's this undertone that concerns Francis of, he uses, rigorism or purity or these kinds of things. But really, I think it's a question of whether or not the entire Second Vatican Council is going to be seen as legitimate, valid, ongoing for the life of the faith. And he's saying that debate is not open. That is not an open question for debate. That this is one of the strongest and clearest statements of my lifetime, that the Second Vatican Council is legitimate, that its reforms, I mean, the Tridentine Mass itself is a reform. It arose as a reform of other things. And so that those reforms are sort of here to stay. And I think that lies behind a lot of the document's goals.
Mike, can you talk a little bit about the timing of this document? Is it tied back to that growth that you were talking about, this explosion in the other countries that we're seeing?
I think so. I mean, from what I've read, I some sources. I have some friends in Rome, but from what I've read more, that he was really encouraged to do this in many ways by the Italian church, that the Italian bishops themselves and a number of the most close collaborators of the Pope in the College of Cardinals were supportive of these reforms, and they were encouraging him to do this. So I think that's part of the timing. I also think that he sees, this might be why I refer to it as one of these hallmark moments, along with, Lampedusa, where he is talking about migrants, the publication of Laudato Si and the environmental questions. And I think he sees the end of life, right? The transition to eternal life, or his at least transition out of the papacy may not be 15 years in the horizon, right? It could be a lot closer than that. And so I think that he sort of wants to ensure that some of these principles of discernment, of synodality, I think what's next to come will be a reform of the Curia. I think that he wants to have these in place, not knowing what the future holds. So I think that's part of the timing as well, is that, he has said a number of times that he envisioned a short papacy. He's now been Pope longer than Pope Benedict was. He passed him, I believe, in January. And so, who knows what the future holds. And so I think he's sort of guiding the church. I wouldn't say he's stacking the deck, but he's guiding the church. He sees this as part of his role in sort of shepherding and pastoring the church forward to implement a number of these quite practical changes.
And, speaking of Pope Benedict, this document isn't necessarily, intended to refute Benedict's widening of the Latin Mass, correct? It really just clarifies it, correct?
Yeah, and I mean, it's sort of unfathomable to think that he wouldn't have seen a copy of this, that Pope Benedict wouldn't have seen a copy of this before it was released. I'm sure he's seen it. I think what Francis argues in the piece is that it was almost an experimental nature of what Pope Benedict did in the earlier text, which was 14 years ago, and that it hasn't borne the ecclesiological fruit that Benedict would have hoped. That would be Francis's interpretation of the situation. That in fact, instead of fostering unity, both with those within the Catholic Church who appreciate the Latin Mass, and even some of those organizations that broke off because they rejected the Second Vatican Council. Pope Benedict had extended a number of olive branches to those organizations. That hadn't occurred in the way Benedict would have hoped. That the unity that Benedict's document was supposed to bring about, Francis sees lamentably as not having taken place. And so now it's time to sort of try something new, I think, or actually in a way return. It's the document is actually closer to what John Paul II had, his policies around the restrictions or availability of the Latin Mass. And so it's sort of being closer to Paul VI and John Paul II's vision than it is to Benedict's in some ways. But again, I agree completely, Mike, that this is not sort of a direct refutation of Benedict's visions, goals, papacy, etc. Mm-hmm. There's a particular connection between Francis and Paul VI. I mean, the more you read Francis's work, you can see that he's the first. I believe he's the first pope to be ordained after the Second Vatican Council, and so he's sort of a man of the council in a really particular way. And I think he sees a special spiritual and governing connection in many ways with Pope Paul VI.
Yeah. Do you think that's an important... Oh, I'm sorry, Mike.
No. Continue.
This goes back to last podcast when you said I asked too many questions. So here we go.
No such thing. Do
you think it's an important distinction to note that Pope Francis is following in footsteps or that have been laid before him, that this is not something that's coming out of left field? He's looking back at precedents?
Sure. I mean, he is someone who is deeply immersed in the living tradition of the church. I mean, everything from like his Marian devotions. I mean, that is an enormous part of the spirituality of Latin America. You think of all of the Latin American countries that have their own specific devotions to Guadalupe and Luján in Argentina. And so, every time he travels, he goes to Santa Maria Maggiore and lays flowers in front of the image of Our Lady there. And so he prays a rosary regularly. He's immersed in this conversation, in this he's building on what came before him. It's not a radical break. It's just a living implementation of the council, of the discernment and the collective presence of the Spirit that he recognizes as being the watershed moment of Vatican II.
And I think in a lot of ways, perhaps we should have seen this coming, in the sense that he's not a pope of the Mediterranean. He's not a pope of Europe. He is a pope of deep Latin America. He's Argentinian. I think sometimes his critics, because his features are so European, I think he gets there's a European look to him. And therefore there's sort of like this psychology. When you look at him, you're going to anticipate a European perspective, when in reality, he is very much Latin American. He's very much Argentinian, and therefore has that worldwide view, or at the very least, a view of an entirely different hemisphere than any pontiff before him. So it's really not that surprising that he would have a completely different perspective than previous popes.
I think most people know my wife is Argentinian, right? So she was born in Argentina, but she then emigrated with her mother for work to Spain. So she lived 20 years in Argentina and 15 years in Spain before we met. And so, I'm particularly interested in the personality of Pope Francis, the formation of Pope Francis, beyond simply what I would be interested in as an ecclesiologist, as sort of a neutral observer. And so there's tremendous research that has been done on this. The best book is by Massimo Borghese. I think it's called The Thought of Pope Francis, or The Mind of Pope Francis, one or the other, but the guy's name is Borghese. And it lays out this formation of Francis in like a deeply intellectual tradition. Most the mischaracterization of him is that he's a pastor but not a theologian, and that, he doesn't really have a lot of sort of academic background. He doesn't have a doctorate, for instance. And so, but this book, along with Austin Ivory's book, I have some of his books almost right here next to me. Those biographies as well point out that there is a really intricate formation in what is called the Teología del Pueblo, the theology of the people. And that school of thought, if you know where to look, is all over the pontificate and all over his ecclesiology. Everything from synodality. The last time I remember we talked about the polyhedron quality of society and the church, all of these themes that can be traced back to his background, to his Latin American background. They are cornerstones of the papacy. And exactly what you're saying, Mike, I think is what happened, my own supposition, is what happened in the conclave, because, he's the child of Italian immigrants. And so I think that some of the cardinals thought, well, he's from down there, but he's really one of us. He grew up speaking Italian and eating pasta, and so he's not going to be so foreign. And that he sort of brought with him all of the global South, the face of the poor and excluded church. He sort of, snuck them in the back door with him when he entered the papal apartments for the first time. And so I think that that is revolutionary. It is traumatic for people. It is eye-opening. It is inspiring. I mean, I don't want to say all these negative phrases. It's like an unbelievable explosion of new thought and voice of people that have been not only excluded, but systematically muzzled from a lot of these conversations for a long time, both in the church and in society. And so it is a totally radical moment, or a revolutionary moment, or a moment pregnant with opportunity, shall we say.
Yeah. Just going back to the Latin Mass one more time,
sure.
I guess we have to assume that this most recent document will not put to bed the argument relating to the Latin Mass. I have to believe, because it doesn't slam the door on it. There are plenty of venues that are still left available to the Latin Mass.
Sure.
But I would imagine that in the near future, not current state, but most likely in the next pontificate, there would still be an expectation of a pushback from the Tridentine folks, right?
Yeah, of course. And I mean, even I'm here in Chicago, and so Cardinal Supich is one of the closest collaborators with both Pope Francis. And so he was, I read his statement, and he was, there's a particular parish that's devoted to it here. And he said, he's going to discern, how to live out the implementation of the motu proprio, but that for now things will continue as they have been before. And so that's someone who's close to Francis, who's sort of taking the pulse of the moment, I think. And I think you're completely right. I don't want to pose it as sort of an us versus them idea. I know that can be read in some of my comments, even here today. It's quite clear where I stand, I think. But that, I want to walk with my brothers and sisters across the church. And I recognize fully, I'm a constant advocate of the need for pluralism within the church, the recognition of pluralism and pluralistic types of liturgical worship, et cetera. And so where this fits in the ongoing future of the church, I think is sort of left to be seen. But I think you're completely right. I mean, we have lots of evidence already that this will not sort of go silently into that dark night, or whatever the phrase would be, that people are invested in it and will continue to probably critique the Francis pontificate. It's another log to throw on the fire there for people that have serious problems with the pontificate. And I don't think that's everyone that's in the Latin Mass community or that reveres the Latin Mass, but those who are most skeptical of Francis's agenda, they sort of gravitate towards some of these conversations. And so I think there's no doubt that will continue. It really is sad and difficult for someone who, I love the church, very deeply. I think I am qualified enough or could have found a job in New Jersey and been close to my family and friends. And here we are, my wife and I, I have friends, of course, but, we're a long way from both of our families because I've been called to do this as a theologian, to live my professional life here. And so it comes from a place of deep love and respect and joy to be part of that community. And so I hope that, when I see the vitriol on Catholic Twitter from the two sides of the aisle, say, it pains my heart, really. I mean, it's really difficult to balance all of that, and it's not new. It's happened for the whole history of Christianity, right? You read it was much worse in some of the early periods where there was, a lot of physical violence in times, but it's still difficult, as that political rhetoric seeps in or infects the church community. It's difficult. It's a difficult moment to live as a theologian and as someone who wants the best for the community and for the people of God. We talked about, we want to talk about a couple of the other columns, but before we move into those columns, I did want to give you your next assignment. I apologize, Jen, for stepping on your toes a little bit, but you are, Mike, you are our chief Vatican watcher for the newspaper, the Catholic Star Herald. So I want you to know that, the next thing that nobody's going to understand, I've been reading up on it myself, and I almost understand it, is the Synod that is going to be coming out in October. It's going to be a global Synod. People are going to be hearing about it a lot more. Most of the documentation has not been released yet, the scheduling and stuff like that, but it's going to be a multi-year synod. However, it's going to be the next big thing in the Catholic Church as a global entity. So I don't think we're expecting any of the specifics related to it until September, which is then when I will have to kick into gear and start as a public relations or as the communications director. I'll have to start kicking into gear from that perspective. But just quickly, can you give a little bit of perspective on the Synod and what's anticipated and why it's happening? Sure. I mean, from a sort of fun perspective to start, I'll be in Rome twice. I'm teaching two classes, one intercession class in January, and I'm taking another group in June. So I'll be on the ground watching, and I'll hear, I'll suffer for all of you in the diocese through long Italian meals to see what I can pick up.
You're a hero, Mike.
But
you're a hero.
We will be expecting food reviews as well as hard news reports from on the scene in Rome.
But on the synod itself, so this is one of the again cornerstone or buzzwords, but deeper than buzzwords. It's the defining principles of Francis's pontificate is this idea of synodality. The word itself, synod, literally means walking with. So the idea of journeying together. Think of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, walking with one another, walking with the Lord. So these are crucial concepts for him. Implementing that, again, nothing new. There's a quote that he uses frequently where I believe it's St. John Chrysostom says the church and synod are synonymous, that those two things go together. And so the idea of what it means for us to be the people that is called and sent forth, and what it means for us to be the people that is journeying together, that changes over the centuries based on historical circumstances, based on lots of theological developments, for instance. And so to continually draw us back to that, it's very Jesuit, right? Continually draw us back to this discernment piece where we are weighing what is coming from the good spirit and what is coming from the evil spirit, the enemy of human nature, if you will, as we walk together as a people on the road to Calvary, and then also from the empty tomb, say, or something. So what the Pope is doing, it's actually going to be a global conversation, as you're saying, about how to implement this. Again, he's always interested in what this looks like on the ground. What does this look like in the local church? What does it look like in the trenches, if you will, although I hate to use war analogies. But what does it, how can this be lived out in these pluralistic contexts? Again, think of a polycentric church. Think of a church that is drawing inspiration from Manila, from Nigeria, from Argentina, from Mexico, from the American church, of course. And so what does it look like to have all these centers? I picture one of those maps like you have with the planes that shows the routes, with all the lines. Yeah. And so you have like all these centers all over the world sort of informing and dialoguing with one another. This is how we bring the gospel message to the ends of the earth, like it's given in the Great Commission. That's he's again putting his finger on the pulse of, or trying to discern and determine how that can actually happen.
Yeah, and for our listeners, synods have been around for millennia. In this case, you'll be hearing more about it in September as the specifics are announced. And then I believe the synod itself starts in Rome, I want to say on October 8th, I think. And then in local dioceses, each local diocese is supposed to be kicking it off on October 17th. I'm pretty sure I got the diocesan date right. The other one might be the October 10th, perhaps. But
there's also the World Meeting of Families is coming up in September as well, right? The one that was in Philly. They're doing the next one in Rome for that.
So yeah. So you'll be hearing more about, because the synod is intended, as Mike said, it's intended to really get the local. So each parish will give information to the diocese. Each diocese will give each information to each province. Each province will give information to each Catholic conference in each country, and then that will go back to the Vatican and therefore. So it's a very, like Mike was saying, while it comes top down, it has a very deep grassroots element to it. So if you have any complaints, you'll be able to register them in early October, mid-October.
One thing I want to add to that is, in addition to, say, the disciples on the road to Emmaus, et cetera, one of the figures that I think about when I think about the synodality question is Thomas, the unfortunately named the Doubting Thomas. And if you think about that story, what happens in that narrative, Thomas doesn't believe, right? So they're all together. He's not there. He says, I will not believe unless I put my hands in the side, etc. And then this is the key point, I think, for this. The next week, he is there, right? So he doesn't say to them, I don't believe any of this thing that Jesus has risen from the dead. I want nothing to do with you. I'm going to go my own way. And they don't say to him, oh, you don't believe us exactly as we're saying it to you? You're not welcome here anymore, right? He's in the community in the midst of his confusion and doubt. And being lost and confused. And so the community, it's sort of a testimony to faith at the margins, or the weeds and the wheat that grow intermingled in all of our own hearts, And so that idea of, who is the church, who gets to speak for the church, who gets to represent the church. I think that Thomas teaches us that it's not always the holiest, right? It's not a hospital for saints. It's not a hotel for saints. It's a hospital for sinners. And so you have Thomas, the community welcomes him in the very midst of his rejection of what they're teaching. In the midst of his doubt, he's still there. And so I think he's really I haven't seen Francis talk much about this, but I would think he's sort of a patron saint figure of these types of conversations about who should be included. I think it's a broad tent, a big tent that Francis seeks to erect on these conversations.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Mike, because personally, when these kinds of events come around, like the Synod, as a lay person, I want to learn more, because I think as a people, we're always trying to learn more about our faith. And my question to you was going to be, why should the everyday person in the pew be keeping an eye on this? But I think you've kind of already talked about it a little bit. It's because it does affect all of us. It does trickle down, and it helps us grow. It's not just coming from the top. Yeah. If we meet them or do our part to read the stories and watch the videos, investigate what's going on, we can learn more about ourselves as well as Catholics.
Yeah, it's different in some ways than collegiality. Those two terms are used interchangeably a lot, because they're both terms that arose in the interpretations of the Second Vatican Council as being important for dialogue within the church, say, And so collegiality is more closely related to the bishops being in fraternal relationship to one another. So, they say cum Petro sub Petrum, like with Peter and under Peter, that there's a fraternal relationship. And Francis has emphasized this a lot. For instance, the pallium, when an archbishop receives the pallium, he changed that so they would receive it in their local church. And so you see this movement away from like the idea that the cardinals and the bishops are somehow like franchise managers or dutiful foot soldiers in a real pyramid style ecclesiology, that you're moving out towards this relationship between the bishops. But what synodality does is infuse the other 99.9% of us with the same sort of goals, or with the same methodology, that people are listening, that they're being able to speak frankly to their experiences, where they are in the journey of life, how the church is called to serve them. Again, Francis's language as a field hospital. Hospital. I mean, that got real very quick for us when we saw field hospitals being erected, right? When people were responding to COVID. It moved from being an analogy to a real life experience for many people as triage units were going up in Atlantic City or whatever. And so where people are being met in the trauma of life in all kinds of ways, both spiritual, physical, metaphorical, etc., I think that synodality can play a role in allowing people to open their hearts to the church community and show their wounded hands to one another, and then receive blessings and support in response. And I think that is sort of some of the goals of the synod or of synodality, is to make that real, whether it's about families, whether it's about young people, whether it's about the synod on synodality itself. That it's this idea of how do we talk to and learn from one another.
So, Mike, you are a how can I put this? You are a constant feature in the Catholic Star Herald. That actually, I have to give you a lot of credit. Your ability to write on very dense topics in a very consumable way on such a regular basis is truly impressive. And I want to thank you for always doing that for us. But Jen and I get the pleasure of reading them first pretty regularly. And oftentimes, we'll look at them and go, wow, that's beautiful. And sometimes we'll look at them and go, I have no idea what he's talking about. Which is not an
family says it looks the same this way and upside down sometimes, especially when it's like something that's going for peer review or something. They're like, I don't know what you're talking about here.
But each of us had an article recently that we wanted to ask you about. I'm going to let Jen go first. Jen, could you talk to him a little bit about what you kind of noticed?
Sure. Well, first off, just to tag on what Mike said there, when you were going to write about the Latin Mass, and I started reading it, and I think we exchanged a correspondence, and you said, "How does it look?" And in my mind, I was like, I understood everything in this. So you were either bringing me up or I'm just getting better at this. But I personally really enjoyed the Latin Mass, not only because I understood it, because it was put in a way that everybody can understand in a way. And that's something that I like about your other columns as well, is you do seem to you're touching upon something that everybody can understand. You were kind of just talking about that, the field hospital and getting to people where we're at. One of the recent columns that I enjoyed in the Catholic Star Herald was in June, I believe. And it was entitled Two Human Beings Trying to Share the Journey of Faith. And it was just talking about, the majority of Christians living out their vocations and wedded life. And you gave some examples of how there are a few married saints. But can you talk a little bit about, why you decided to write about that and why that's important to you, first off, and then I have a follow-up for that.
Sure. So I'm taking an hour out of today when we're recording. This is my wedding anniversary today, actually.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. We got married. I don't know, people in the diocese would know. Father Dave Grover and Father Ken Hallahan. I've known them both in different ways. Father Dave since I was a kid, and Father Ken as a more academic colleague from conferences. And so they performed a bilingual mass for us. And then we had the reception at the Mushalu, the boat in Philly there.
Oh, sure. I love that place. Beautiful.
Yep. So it was 2 years ago, very eventful 2 years. But so there's a great book by Rick Gallardi. People know that name. It's he's a tremendous theologian, ecclesiologist at Boston College. And he's the chair of the department, I believe. And he has a book called A Daring Promise. And so it's I think a Christian spirituality of marriage or something. And so some of this was informed by that, at least at a thematic level, in the air somewhere as I was thinking about this. And then also that particular piece was drawn from, I love art. And so there was some, allusions to specific works of art in there. Mm-hmm. But I think that is, in some ways, it actually connects quite closely to our previous conversation here around what does it mean to walk the journey of life together? What does it mean for us as a people of God, to do that? And what does it mean to do that in a special, intentional, committed way with another human person? And I think that's what marriage is about. We've had I guess the idea of a camino or a journey. It's a lot different than if I met my wife in a bar in Chicago, right? That we have had to walk the immigration path together to bring her here, the separation that means, her own experience. She will have lived, more than a decade on 3 different continents. So it's sort of like 3 lifetimes in one. And so some of that narrative around the pilgrimage of life, the camino, the journey of life, for us, that takes on a really lived experience through my own moving in different cities and different universities and things. And I continue to go to Europe, and I do a lot of global engagement work for the university, so I travel quite a bit. And then my wife's. And so, we're traveling that path together in many ways. I mean, we're about to have our first baby next month. And so that idea of sharing the Christian life with one another, meeting people where they are, we have very different, I would say, belief structures or at least experiences with the church and what we find problematic in it, what we love about it, our doubts about it, our own journeys are very different. I remember saying to someone once, I stand in front of a Caravaggio and I'm like, why does this not make you feel the way it makes me feel when I look at this art? but she has like music in her soul. You know, there's rumba music and salsa music in our house at all times, and that's not me at all. And so I like it. You know, I don't have a problem with it. But like, you know, what like sort of our own souls sort of rise and fall according to their own tides in some ways. And so how two people can walk together on that path and really be committed, vulnerable, and supportive with one another. There are certainly analogs to our life of faith and how we do that with Christ when we are doing that with another person, with all the challenges. I'm sure she's ready to kill me half the time, you know, but with all the challenges that that entails.
Well, first off, I'm a little jealous that your music selections sound a little bit more high end than mine. In my house, my husband plays Journey 24 hours a day. So not that there's anything wrong.
What is the problem with that? That is outstanding. That is quality theological music right there.
But another point that you made in that column specifically, I'm going to just read this because I couldn't do it justice if I tried. But and again, you're talking about a specific piece of art here, but you say a married couple encouraging and gazing at one another from their own crosses is in many ways an apt image of the Christian life for many of us, and a bit surprising to me that more artists and authors have not latched onto its intrinsic power, even going as far to say that human beings tremble a bit to portray it too realistically. In your opinion, or do you, but put this way, I know how I feel. I wish there were more couples that were held up as examples. And so it made us feel a little less like islands.
Yeah, I think first, like the movement away from a stained glass spirituality, where we look at these figures that we revere as somehow, well, we don't have to emulate any of that. That's for the saints who are working miracles and magic somewhere. And what does it mean to say that, you know, they were real people that lived real lives, had real challenges. And so how do we try to emulate that and live that without being too facile or hagiographical? I mean, like, so, you know, without over spiritualizing it, how do we try to treat people as we want to be treated, walk with people with compassion, right? Compassio, suffering with. How do we enact that in our daily lives, I think is, again, a question that can be read through marriage conversations.
Well, I am very honored that you spent part of your anniversary with us together. So, and it was a coincidence that we talked about this column. I did not know that. So congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
So we have about 2.5 minutes left. So I'm not going to get into much of the one that I was going to.
Oh, we can't cover the history of church and state relations in 2 minutes?
How did you know that was what I was going to ask about? But I do encourage people to go to CatholicStarHerald.org and type in Michael Canaris and take a look at some of your stuff. Because, you know, we've had you write thematically over the years, but I tend to truly appreciate getting the columns that we get from you, because they do cover a wide swath. And for one of them is church and state. Another one, the one I was going to ask you about, was depicting invisible realities in art. It's good to know that you have this appreciation for art. You know, in your column, you talk about how Christianity very much embraces art, but the Muslim and Jewish faiths actually actively avoid any representations of art.
Of God. I mean, they have beautiful art and architecture, obviously, but of the figures in the same way that we do. Yeah.
Right. Or for that matter, even the Jewish religion. I was working for a law firm in Philadelphia. It was predominantly Jewish law firm, corporate law firm. And I got a note from one of my colleagues, and I saw how they had written God, which is G-D. And I went, was this a typo? And they go, no, that's how we do it. We don't put the O in God. And
the name that is so holy that we tremble before it, right?
Yeah, which makes complete sense. But as a little Christian out of Deepwater, South Jersey, that blew my mind. And I quickly, but I had a great appreciation for it, actually. As a matter of fact, the irony was I worked there for 4 or 5 years. And the first time I went to a synagogue, was actually working for the Catholic Church. Bishop Sullivan had been invited to speak on the occasion of Nostra Aetate, and I got to go in. It was the first time wearing the yarmulke. It was beautiful. I loved it. But you talk about the Ignatian year. One of your articles is pondering the fate of Judas, our brother. Dreaming of a Pope-inspired post-pandemic world. There's a lot of great things in here. So if our listeners haven't had a chance yet to check out the newspaper or go online and check your stuff there, we greatly appreciate that. Mike, thank you very much for joining with us today. We really appreciate it. Jen, thank you very much for being my co-host today. You did a great job on your first stint co-hosting. I look forward to having you on much more often. As a matter of fact, you might be the permanent co-host for all the Michael Canaris episodes, particularly when we have his future one about the Synod, let's say in early October. All right, everybody. Thank you all for listening and have a great rest of your day. See ya.